Welcome to another episode of Serial Killer Files by Skoob, where we dive deep into the most chilling tales from America's criminal past. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and today we're traveling back to the early 1900s to explore one of the most horrifying and mysterious cases in American crime history. This is the story of Belle Gunness, a woman who turned the promise of love into a death sentence, who transformed the American dream into an absolute nightmare. Picture this. It's 1881, and a young Norwegian woman steps off a ship onto American soil, her eyes filled with hope and dreams of a better life. Her name was Brynhild Paulsdatter Sturseth, born on November 11, 1859, in the small village of Selbu, Norway. Like thousands of other Norwegian immigrants, she came seeking the American dream. She would eventually become known as Belle Gunness, a name that would strike fear into the hearts of lonely men across the Midwest. At first glance, Belle seemed to embody everything admirable about the immigrant experience. She was hardworking, determined, and resourceful. By the early 1900s, she had established herself as a successful farm owner in LaPorte, Indiana. She appeared to be living proof that with enough determination, anyone could make it in America. But beneath this facade of respectability lurked something far more sinister. The first red flags appeared in 1884, when Belle married her first husband, Mats Ditlev Anton Sørensen. Together, they ran a small confectionery business in Chicago. But their entrepreneurial journey was marked by a series of suspicious fires. First, their store burned down under mysterious circumstances, and they collected insurance money. Then their home also went up in flames, and once again, insurance paid out handsomely. Neither fire was ever properly explained. But the fires were just the beginning. 2 of their children died of what doctors called acute colitis, but the symptoms looked suspiciously like poisoning. Today's medical experts believe these deaths were likely the result of deliberate poisoning, though it was never proven at the time. The most shocking death, however, was that of Mads himself in 1900. He died on the exact day when one life insurance policy expired and another began, meaning Belle collected double the payout in a single moment. She told doctors he had come home with a headache. She gave him medicine, and by morning, he was dead. No autopsy was performed. The timing was too perfect, the circumstances too convenient. Many now believe this was Belle's first adult murder, possibly using strychnine, a poison she would later perfect as her weapon of choice. With the insurance money from Mads's death, Belle purchased her infamous farm in LaPorte, Indiana, the place that would become her killing ground. But before we dive into the horrors that unfolded there, we need to understand how Belle operated. She was no impulsive killer acting in the heat of passion. She was a calculating predator who turned the basic human need for love and companionship into a deadly trap. In an era before the internet, before social media, lonely hearts found each other through personal advertisements in newspapers. Belle understood this system perfectly and exploited it with chilling efficiency. She placed carefully crafted ads in Scandinavian-language newspapers, targeting immigrants and men with roots in Norway, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and other Midwest areas. One of her actual advertisements read, "Personal, comely widow who owns a large farm in one of the finest districts in LaPorte County, Indiana, desires to make the acquaintance of a gentleman equally well provided with view of joining fortunes. No replies by letter considered unless sender is willing to follow answer with personal visit. Triflers need not apply." Notice how carefully worded this was. She presented herself as wealthy and established, seeking an equally well-provided gentleman. The phrase joining fortunes suggested partnership and mutual benefit. But most cunningly, she insisted that only serious men who were willing to visit her in person should respond. This wasn't about filtering out casual inquiries. It was about getting her victims to come to her killing ground. The letters Belle wrote to potential suitors were masterpieces of manipulation. To Andrew Helgelian, one of her last victims, she wrote, "To the dearest friend in the world, no woman in the world is happier than I am. I know that you are now to come to me and be my own. I can tell from your letters that you are the man I want. We will be all alone with each other. Can you conceive of anything nicer?" But alongside these romantic promises, Belle always included very specific financial instructions. She told men to sell their property, bring cash, and travel secretly. She even instructed some to sew their money into their clothing for safekeeping. These weren't suggestions. They were requirements for anyone hoping to meet her. What made Belle so effective was her deep understanding of her victim's psychology. She targeted isolated men, often immigrants like herself, who had few close family ties. These were men who had worked hard, saved money, but found themselves alone in a foreign country. She offered them exactly what they craved most: love, partnership, and belonging. As one historian noted, like any psychopath, she was very shrewd in identifying potential victims. She knew exactly how to beguile them with promises of love and a picture of a sweet country life. Belle's farm in LaPorte became one of America's most prolific killing fields, though nobody realized it at the time. Her method was chillingly consistent: poison followed by brutal violence, then careful disposal of the evidence. She had turned murder into an efficient business operation. When her carefully selected victims arrived at the farm, Belle would typically welcome them warmly, playing the part of the loving widow to perfection. She'd prepare meals laced with poison, often strychnine, which would incapacitate her victims quickly. Then, to ensure they were dead, she would finish the job with blunt force trauma, usually an axe or hammer to the head. But Belle's efficiency didn't stop with the murders. She had developed a systematic approach to disposing of bodies that would make her crimes incredibly difficult to detect. She would dismember the corpses and bury the parts in shallow graves around her property, particularly near the hog pen and garden areas. Some remains were wrapped in burlap sacks, and body parts were often buried separately to make identification more difficult. There's even evidence that she may have fed some remains to her hogs, ensuring complete disposal of the evidence. Her victim list reads like a roll call of the American dream turned nightmare. John Moe from Elbow Lake, Minnesota, arrived with more than $1,000 in cash, a fortune in those days. He was supposed to help Belle pay off her farm mortgage, but within a week he had vanished entirely. Henry Gerholt from Wisconsin wrote enthusiastically to his family after arriving, saying he was well and happy and asking for seed potatoes to be sent. Those were the last words his family ever heard from him. George Anderson from Tarkio, Missouri, was one of the few men who escaped Belle's farm alive. According to his account, he awoke one night to find Belle standing over his bed, with a strange, predatory look in her eyes. Something in that moment told him to flee, and he escaped the farm the next morning, convinced that something was terribly wrong. His instincts saved his life. Not all men were so fortunate. Olaf Svenherud and Olaf Lindblom both answered Belle's ads seeking love and partnership. Their remains were later found buried on the property, along with personal items that confirmed their identities. Ole B. Budsberg, a widower from Wisconsin, had sold his land and sent money to his sons before traveling to meet Belle. His family never heard from him again. Between these named victims and the unidentified remains found on the property, investigators estimated that Belle had killed at least 14 people, though some believe the number could be much higher, possibly more than 40 victims total. Perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Belle's crimes was how they extended to her own family. The very children she was supposed to protect became victims of her insatiable greed and cold calculation. This wasn't just about killing strangers for money. Belle was willing to murder anyone, including her own children, if it served her financial interests. Her pattern of familial murder began early. After marrying Mads Sorensen, Belle had or adopted several children. Two of these children, Caroline and Axel, died in infancy from what was officially recorded as inflammation of the large intestine. But these symptoms matched arsenic poisoning perfectly. Neighbors later recalled that Belle had never seemed pregnant before these births, and they suspected the deaths weren't natural. More tellingly, Belle had insured these children and collected payouts after their deaths. When Belle remarried Peter Gunness in 1902, she gained a stepchild, Peter's young daughter, Swanhild. Within just 1 week of the marriage, this innocent child was dead. The official cause was listed as unknown, but poisoning was strongly suspected. Peter himself lasted only 8 months before dying from what Belle claimed was an accident with a falling sausage grinder. But one of the children had told a classmate that Belle killed her stepfather with a meat cleaver. Despite these suspicions, Belle managed to convince authorities to rule it an accident and once again collected insurance money. The most tragic chapter in this family saga occurred on April 28, 1908. Belle's 3 remaining children, Myrtle, Lucy, and young Philip, all died in the fire that consumed the farmhouse. But this wasn't a tragic accident that claimed innocent lives. Many believe Belle deliberately killed her own children as part of an elaborate plan to fake her own death and escape justice. The evidence for this horrific theory is compelling. The children's bodies were found in their beds, suggesting they hadn't tried to escape the fire, possibly because they had been poisoned first. Belle's own body was found headless and didn't match her known size and build. Many believe she killed another woman, possibly a vagrant or one of the few female victims she had taken, and used that corpse to fake her own death. This wasn't just about escaping the law. It was about escaping with her money. Belle had accumulated substantial wealth from insurance payouts and the cash her victims brought to the farm. By faking her death, she could disappear with all of it while avoiding prosecution for her crimes. But Belle's willingness to murder her own children reveals something truly chilling about her psychology. These weren't crimes of passion or even simple greed. They were the actions of someone completely devoid of normal human emotions, someone who saw other people, even her own children, as nothing more than obstacles to be removed when convenient. April 28, 1908, was the night that would expose one of America's most prolific serial killers and create a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. In the early morning hours, flames engulfed Belle Gunness's farmhouse in LaPorte, Indiana. What began as an apparent tragic house fire would soon reveal a horror beyond anyone's imagination. The farm's hired hand woke to smoke and flames and barely managed to escape with his life. By the time firefighters arrived, the house was almost completely destroyed. In the cellar beneath the ruins, they discovered 4 bodies. 3 were Belle's children, Myrtle, Lucy, and Philip, found dead in their beds. The 4th was the headless corpse of an adult woman, initially assumed to be Belle herself. But from the very beginning, something didn't feel right about this supposed tragedy. The headless body was significantly smaller and thinner than Belle had been. Neighbors who had known her for years insisted the corpse couldn't be her. The missing head was never found, despite extensive searches of the burned debris. As authorities were still processing the fire scene, a man named Asa Helgelian arrived in LaPorte. He had traveled from South Dakota looking for his brother Andrew, who had been corresponding with Belle for months before visiting her farm. When Andrew's letters suddenly stopped coming, Asa became suspicious and decided to investigate personally. His arrival would trigger the discovery that transformed a house fire into one of America's most shocking crime scenes. At Asa's urging, sheriff's deputies began searching the farmyard for any trace of his missing brother. What they found was beyond their worst nightmares. The first shallow grave they uncovered contained human remains. Then they found another, and another. Over the following days, the farm yielded a gruesome harvest of body parts and personal belongings that revealed the true scope of Belle's crimes. The remains of Andrew Helgelian were eventually identified among the buried corpses, but he was far from alone. The investigators uncovered dismembered bodies showing clear signs of blunt force trauma, skulls crushed by axes or hammers, limbs separated and buried separately to hinder identification. Personal belongings like watches, rings, and clothing helped identify some victims, while others remained anonymous victims of Belle's systematic killing spree. Each new discovery painted a clearer picture of Belle's methods. She hadn't just been killing the occasional suitor, she had been operating what amounted to a murder factory, processing victim after victim with industrial efficiency. The shallow graves near the hog pen and garden areas suggested she had been disposing of bodies this way for years. But the biggest mystery remained. Where was Belle? The more investigators learned about her crimes, the more suspicious they became about the headless corpse. The timing seemed too convenient. Just as her crimes were about to be exposed, she supposedly dies in a fire that destroys most of the evidence. Many began to suspect that Belle had orchestrated the entire scenario. The question of whether Belle Gunness died in the 1908 fire or escaped to live under a new identity has captivated investigators and true crime enthusiasts for more than a century. The evidence for her escape is compelling and points to a carefully planned exit strategy that was typical of her calculating nature. Ray Lamphere, Belle's former hired hand and sometime lover, was arrested for arson in connection with the fire. Before he died in prison, Lamphere made claims that would fuel decades of speculation. He insisted that Belle had planned the entire fire as her escape route. According to Lamphere, she had killed another woman, dressed the corpse in her clothes, removed her false teeth, and placed them near the body, then set the fire and fled with her accumulated wealth. This theory makes considerable sense when you consider Belle's character. She was a long-term planner who thought several steps ahead. She had been collecting insurance money and cash from victims for years, accumulating what would have been a substantial fortune in 1908. As suspicion about missing men began to grow, particularly after Asa Helgelian started asking questions about his brother, Belle would have realized that discovery was imminent. The physical evidence also supports the escape theory. The headless woman's body was not only smaller than Belle, but the head was never found despite extensive searches. Belle's false teeth were conveniently discovered near the corpse, exactly what someone would plant to establish identity in an era before DNA testing. Most telling of all, Belle's children were found dead in their beds, suggesting they may have been poisoned before the fire started. This wasn't a tragic accident. It was a methodical elimination of loose ends. Over the years following the fire, there were numerous reported sightings of Belle across the United States. People claimed to have seen a woman matching her description in cities from California to New York. While none of these sightings were ever definitively confirmed, they kept the mystery alive in the public imagination. Some witnesses were convincing enough that law enforcement took their reports seriously. In 2008, exactly 100 years after the fire, forensic scientists attempted to solve the mystery using modern DNA technology. They tried to extract genetic material from the charred remains found in 1908 and compare it with DNA from Belle's hair found on letters she had written. Unfortunately, the century-old samples were too degraded to yield conclusive results. The mystery remains officially unsolved, but perhaps the most compelling evidence for Belle's escape lies in what we know about her psychology. This was a woman who had been successfully deceiving people for decades. She had fooled doctors, coroners, insurance investigators, and entire communities. She had been planning and executing complex schemes since at least the 1880s. The idea that she would be caught off guard by a house fire seems inconsistent with everything we know about her calculating nature. If Belle did escape, she would have needed to completely reinvent herself. She would have had to change her appearance, adopt a new identity, and carefully manage her accumulated wealth without drawing attention. Given her demonstrated skills in deception and long-term planning, this would have been entirely within her capabilities. More than a century after Belle Gunness disappeared into history, her story continues to fascinate and horrify us. She has earned nicknames like Lady Bluebeard and Hell's Belle, becoming a fixture in American folklore alongside other notorious criminals. But what makes her case so compelling isn't just the number of victims or the brutality of her methods. It's how her story reveals something deeply unsettling about human nature and the American experience itself. Belle Gunness represents a darkened version of the American dream. She came to this country as an immigrant seeking a better life, and in many ways, she achieved remarkable success. She owned property, ran a successful farm, and accumulated significant wealth. By all outward appearances, she was living proof that America offered opportunities for anyone willing to work hard. But she achieved this success through the systematic murder of people who shared that same dream. Her victims were largely fellow immigrants, men who had worked hard, saved money, and dared to hope for love and companionship in their adopted homeland. They answered her advertisements believing they had found someone who understood their experience, someone who could share their hopes and dreams. Instead, they found a predator who used their loneliness and hope against them. The case also reveals how much criminal investigation has changed over the past century. Belle operated in an era before fingerprinting was widely used, before systematic record-keeping, before DNA analysis. She could change her name, move between states, and reinvent her identity with relative ease. Her crimes spanned years, partly because the tools to detect patterns and connect cases across jurisdictions simply didn't exist yet. But perhaps most chilling is what Belle's story tells us about the capacity for evil that can hide behind a mask of respectability. To her neighbors, she appeared to be a hard-working widow trying to make an honest living. She attended church, raised children, and participated in community life. The idea that this seemingly ordinary woman was systematically murdering people in her basement would have been almost impossible for her contemporaries to accept. Modern criminal psychology has given us better tools to understand predators like Belle Gunness. We now recognize the signs of psychopathy, the patterns of serial killing, and the methods predators use to select and groom victims. We understand that serial killers often appear normal on the surface and may even be pillars of their communities. But in Belle's time, the very concept of a serial killer, especially a female one, was largely unknown. Belle's case also highlights the vulnerability of isolated individuals in society. Her victims were largely men who had few close family ties, who wouldn't be immediately missed if they disappeared. She understood this isolation and exploited it ruthlessly. In our modern connected world, it's harder for people to simply vanish without a trace. But the basic dynamic of predators targeting isolated victims remains relevant. The question of Belle's ultimate fate continues to intrigue investigators and amateur sleuths. Did she die in the fire, or did she successfully escape to live out her days under a new identity? In some ways, the uncertainty adds to her mystique. She has become a sort of criminal ghost story, a figure who might have walked among us for decades after her supposed death. As we close the chapter on Belle Gunness, the mystery still burns. Did she perish in the fire of 1908, Or was the headless body her final brilliant deception? If Belle escaped, how many years did she live quietly under another name, carrying her secrets to the grave? What's undeniable is her place among the most calculating serial killers in American history. Belle weaponized love, trust, and loneliness, murdering husbands, suitors, and even her own children for profit. To the world, she was a simple widow. Behind closed doors, she was a predator hiding in plain sight. Her victims weren't foolish. They were hopeful. Immigrants chasing connection in a new land, drawn in by promises that ended in shallow graves on an Indiana farm. More than a century later, Belle's story still warns us. Monsters don't always look monstrous. Sometimes they look ordinary. And the unanswered questions, they're even darker than the crimes themselves. To uncover the full story, the hidden theories, and the details history couldn't bury, download the Skoob app now and dive deeper into the chilling mystery of Belle Gunness.